In a world where the visible dominates our senses, the forces that operate in the shadows seem distant, almost unreal. But what if the greatest dangers were not in grand temptations, but in the small and subtle manipulations that lead us astray? C.S. Lewis, in the Screwtape Letters, introduces us to Screwtape, an experienced demon who reveals silent and effective tactics for diverting humans away from God. In his instructions to the young wormwood, Screwtape outlines 4 insidious strategies that demand our attention and vigilance. First, he criticizes the use of reasoning, preferring to manipulate perceptions with propaganda and jargon. Next, he highlights the disconnection between thought and action, keeping people too busy to apply their beliefs. The third tactic involves attachment to what is sensory, diverting focus away from the supernatural. Finally, he relies on the illusion of superficial knowledge, convincing us that we already know all we need to know. These seemingly harmless strategies reveal a spiritual battleground where every decision and every thought becomes crucial. After all, who can resist what they cannot see if they are not first attentive to what they feel? Let's read the letter first. My dear Wormwood, I note what you say about guiding our patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle naive? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not, and if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing, and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed, ever since he was a boy, to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous, that it is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle onto the enemy's own ground. He can argue too, whereas in really practical propaganda of the kind I am suggesting, he has been shown for centuries to be greatly the inferior of our Father below. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experiences. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real. Remember, he is not, like you, a pure spirit. Never having been a human, oh, that abominable advantage of the enemies. You don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind, beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a moment. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years' work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control, and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. The enemy presumably made the counter-suggestion. You know how one can never quite overhear what he says to them, that this was more important than lunch. At least I think that must have been his line for when I said quite. In fact, much too important to tackle at the end of a morning. The patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into it, with a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper, and a number 73 bus going past, and before he reached the bottom of the steps I had got into him an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him that all that sort of thing just couldn't be true. He knew he'd had a narrow escape, and in later years was fond of talking about that inarticulate sense, for actuality which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He is now safe in our Father's house. You begin to see the point. Thanks to processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in the unfamiliar while the familiar is before their eyes. Keep pressing home on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science, I mean the real sciences, as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real life. But the best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the results of modern investigation. Do remember, you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose it was our job to teach your affectionate uncle. Screwtape, manipulation of perception and reason. Reflecting on this passage from C.S. Lewis's Letters from a Screwtape to His Apprentice, I realize that it provides a sharp critique of how reason and perception are manipulated to divert attention from spiritual matters. Screwtape's discourse, A Demon Instructor, points to a scenario where the use of argumentation has weakened and superficiality has prevailed, making it easier to divert people from the pursuit of deeper truths. Analyzing Screwtape's comments on argumentation, I see that he notices a significant change in how people interact with ideas over time. In the past, he says, people were concerned with whether something was proven or not, and this made all the difference in how they accepted or rejected an idea. Faith was something that could be defended through clear and logical reasoning, leading people to change their lives based on a truth they recognized. Today, however, I see that Screwtape believes this approach is no longer as effective in diverting people from faith. He realizes that attempting to argue poses a risk of awakening in the patient, a search for deeper truths, prompting reflection on spiritual matters. This represents a danger to his plans, as reason may become a path for the person to draw closer to God. I thus perceive that Screwtape criticizes today's society for no longer valuing logical and argumentative thinking. Our modern tendency, which he mentions, is to absorb ideas without the same rigor as before, leaving us vulnerable to manipulation and influences coming through the media and popular culture. Screwtape suggests that, instead of trying to convince someone that an idea is true, it is more effective to sell the idea as something that sounds strong, modern, or practical. Reflecting on this, I see that he criticizes the superficiality with which we handle ideas nowadays. Instead of delving into the truth or falsehood of a philosophy, we often content ourselves with labeling ideas as outdated or fashionable, without considering their implications. This point makes me think about how we are influenced by labels and slogans. The strategy Screwtape mentions is based on creating an appearance of wisdom or knowledge that is, in fact, shallow. For example, someone might reject a religious belief simply because it is considered outdated, without ever questioning whether it is true or not. Screwtape knows that this type of manipulation is powerful because it diverts our attention from what is essential. Reflecting on Screwtape's critique of the superficiality of contemporary thought, I realize how this affects spirituality. He warns us that by getting carried away by categories like academic or practical, we run the risk of ignoring deeper spiritual matters. Thus, it's easy to devalue the importance of faith and the transcendental as we reduce everything to what is sensory and immediate, what seems more real to us. Screwtape gives us an important alert about the danger of emotional persuasion. He knows it is easier to manipulate someone by appealing to their emotions rather than their reason. This makes me think about how emotions can be used to divert us from deep reflection. When we are led by emotional appeals, we are more susceptible to accepting ideas without questioning them, as they seem attractive or aligned with our feelings. Screwtape recognizes that when someone begins to seriously reflect on their existence and the big questions of life, there is a risk that this person may draw closer to God. Rational reflection can lead to a spiritual awakening, as it forces the individual to consider realities beyond what is visible and immediate. This makes me realize that reason and faith are not enemies. Rather, they can complement each other. By using reason, I can find a path that leads me to question not just the world around me, but also the deeper meaning of my life. This view makes me value even more the role of critical thinking and the search for truth in the Christian faith. Argumentation is not just an intellectual defense, but a way to awaken the mind to the possibility of a greater reality. While Screwtape fears that his patient might reach these reflections, I see that, for us, reflection is an opportunity to strengthen our faith and to draw closer to what is true, even when the world around us tries to distract us. The disconnection between thinking and acting. As I delve into Screwtape's instructions, I note an important critique regarding the separation between thinking and acting in humans. He highlights how, in the current context, people tend to reflect on ideas, but often do not let these reflections change their way of living. This reveals a weakening of the capacity to unite the mind and behavior in a meaningful way, a problem that he and his demon nephew use to their advantage. Screwtape points out that, in the past, people were more likely to adjust their lives based on the truths they discovered through reflection and argumentation. If they encountered a compelling truth, this truth directly influenced their daily actions and choices. I see this as a portrait of a world where ideas had a real impact on the way of living. However, Screwtape highlights that today, this connection is broken. People might accept an idea or even find it interesting, but this does not necessarily translate into practical changes. This makes me think about how easy it is, in our time, to debate profound concepts, but keep them restricted to the realm of intellectual discussions, without letting them penetrate our practical life. This separation between thought and action represents, for Screwtape, an advantage in his attempt to keep people away from God. After all, the Christian faith is not limited to a system of beliefs, but demands a transformation of life. Reflecting on this, I realize that true conversion is more than intellectual assent. It is an invitation for the entire life to be transformed by the truth that is known. Screwtape mentions how daily concerns are a powerful tool to divert people's minds from spiritual matters. When I read about his example of the patient who, in the midst of a moment of reflection, is distracted by the suggestion that it is time for lunch, I realize how small distractions can have a big impact on our spiritual life. This makes me reflect on how much daily life can keep us caught in a cycle of occupations and pressures that distance us from deeper reflection. The urgencies of practical life, such as work, social commitments, and even trivial distractions, have the power to disconnect us from the most important spiritual issues. Screwtape warns us that by keeping the patient focused on what he calls real life, that is, the constant flow of sensory experiences, he can keep him from thinking about the transcendental. This critique makes me think about how I myself sometimes fall into this cycle of distractions, neglecting time to reflect, pray, or meditate on the Word of God. Deep spirituality requires a space where the mind can focus on heavenly things, but this is challenging when we are immersed in the pressures of everyday life. Considering what Screwtape says, I realize that this disconnection has profound theological implications. Christian faith is a faith that calls us to a transformation where a renewed mind results in a renewed life. When this link between what we think and what we do is weakened, we lose sight of the essence of discipleship, which is to follow Christ in all aspects of life. Screwtape fears that by making the patient reflect on universal issues and eternity, he might be led to reevaluate his priorities and find a meaning that transcends immediate concerns. Christian theology has always insisted that truth is not just something that is known, but something that is lived. This makes me think that if I truly believe in something, that belief should shape my actions, my choices, and the way I live daily. The devil's strategy, then, is precisely to maintain this separation, so that even when someone is touched by a higher thought or idea, that moment does not translate into a real change of life. This reminds me that, to not fall into this trap, I need to seek a spirituality that unites mind and heart, belief and practice, reflection and transformation of life. The devaluation of the supernatural and the attachment to the real. While reflecting on Screwtape's guidance to Wormwood, I see that he presents a very subtle strategy to keep people away from faith, keeping their focus on what is sensory, concrete, and immediate, to the detriment of spiritual matters. He leads us to realize how, in our daily lives, we can be carried away by a limited view of what is real, disregarding everything that is not immediately visible or tangible. Screwtape suggests that one of the best ways to keep the patient away from God is to ensure that he focuses his attention only on what he can see, touch, and experience in his daily life. This emphasis on what is sensory and immediate is called by him real life. Reflecting on this, I realize that he is criticizing the human tendency to value only what is physical and concrete, while disregarding or ignoring what is spiritual. Thinking about this, I realize how this strategy is still very present in the modern world. People are constantly encouraged to prioritize what is practical and immediate: work, material goods, entertainment. Amid all this, it's easy to forget that there is a spiritual reality that is not seen, but is equally true and relevant. For Screwtape, this is an opportunity to keep people away from the enemy, God, because while they only worry about real life, the sensory and immediate aspects, they will have little or no inclination to think about the supernatural. For me, this passage brings a deep reflection on how spirituality requires us to be open to what goes beyond what the eyes can see. Jesus calls us to a faith that looks beyond the visible, that is grounded in eternal things and not just transient ones. However, it isn't easy to lose this focus when I am so immersed in the demands and concerns of everyday life. Screwtape makes it a point to emphasize that materialism does not need to be defended as a truth, but only promoted as something that seems strong or courageous. This makes me think about how often we are influenced to adopt a worldview of materialism without even realizing it. It's not about believing that only what is material exists, but about acting as if this were true, living in a way that spiritual matters are relegated to the background. This materialistic view ends up being seen as the philosophy of the future, while spirituality is labeled as something outdated. Reflecting on this, I realize that the world around me often presents faith in God as an outdated idea, incompatible with the modern worldview. However, Screwtape's approach reveals that this image of materialism as a courageous stance is just a way to keep people away from the deeper spiritual truths. The struggle he describes between the focus on the material and the openness to the spiritual is in essence a battle between two ways of viewing the world. If I let myself be carried away by the idea that only the tangible matters, I run the risk of distancing myself from the truth that God operates in a dimension that goes beyond what I can touch and see. Christian faith calls me to look beyond appearances, to perceive God's presence in all things, and to recognize that there are spiritual realities that are not evident to the senses, but that are essential for a full life. The example Screwtape gives us of the patient who leaves the museum and is distracted by the newspaper vendor and the bus is particularly illustrative. He shows how easy it is for us humans to let the familiarity of everyday life convince us that what we see and hear is all there is. I think about how many times I myself have been carried away by this restricted view of reality, considering that real life is just what I can perceive with my senses. Screwtape warns us that this is one of the most effective ways to prevent someone from thinking about God, by focusing the person's attention on what is real in the sense of being concrete and immediate. He can divert the mind from deeper reflections on the meaning of life and the existence of a greater plan. This makes me reflect on the importance of cultivating moments of contemplation, prayer, and reading the scriptures, to not be absorbed by the demands of everyday life. In the Christian life, I am called to recognize that the true real life is not limited to what I see and what I experience in the present moment. Jesus teaches us that there is a spiritual reality that transcends the visible, and that our life here should be lived with our eyes turned towards that greater reality. Screwtape's strategy is a reminder that I need to be aware of this temptation to reduce the world to what is sensory and immediate, and to fight to keep my heart and mind open to the spiritual truths that go beyond what is visible. The danger of superficial knowledge. As I delve deeper into Screwtape's instructions, I see that he highlights a very effective strategy to keep people away from a true understanding of spirituality, fostering in them the illusion that they already know everything that is necessary. Screwtape suggests that a grandiose idea of intellectual self-sufficiency can be more effective in keeping someone away from the truth than complete ignorance. This point makes me reflect on the danger of superficial knowledge and how it can distance us from a sincere search for truth. Screwtape mentions that it is more effective to keep the patient thinking that he already knows everything about what is important, rather than encouraging him to really study any topic deeply. Reflecting on this, I realize that this is a direct critique of our modern tendency to be content with shallow information. Nowadays, we often think we understand a topic just because we've read a headline or heard a superficial opinion about it. I see that this strategy manifests in the way we can be led to believe that we know the Christian faith without ever having delved into its mysteries and deeper teachings. Screwtape knows that if the person believes that they already have a clear and comprehensive idea about God and the spiritual truths, they will not see the need to explore further or to question their own convictions. This leads me to reflect on how easy it is to fall into the trap of thinking that I already know enough about God, the Bible, or life itself. This posture of intellectual self-sufficiency makes us less open to the humility that is necessary to truly learn and to allow the Holy Spirit to guide us towards a deeper and transformative understanding. Screwtape warns us about the dangers of allowing his patient to venture into sciences that touch on immaterial realities, like modern physics. He knows that by exploring issues that challenge the strictly materialistic understanding of the world, the person can open up to the idea that there is something beyond what is visible. This makes me think that science, far from being an enemy of faith, can be a pathway that leads us to contemplate the greatness of God's creation. I realize that the real problem for Screwtape is not science itself, but the superficiality with which we often approach it. He prefers that people have a vague and general notion of the results of modern research without ever really studying them. Thus, it creates the impression that science has explained everything, even when many fundamental questions remain unanswered. This reflection makes me value the importance of a sincere and deep search for knowledge, both in the sciences and in theology. True faith does not fear difficult questions because it knows that God is the truth. When we delve into the mysteries of the universe, we can marvel at the complexity of creation and, through this admiration, open ourselves to a vision of the transcendental. This is a direct contrast to Screwtape's view, which prefers to keep people under the illusion that they already know enough. Screwtape emphasizes that it is better to confuse people's minds than to enlighten them, giving them a sense of possessing comprehensive knowledge without in fact having it. This makes me think about how, in the modern world, we are bombarded with an enormous amount of information, but are seldom encouraged to reflect deeply on it. I realize that this approach creates a mentality that is resistant to true learning and to spiritual openness. When someone thinks they already know enough, they become less willing to consider new perspectives or to explore the depths of the Christian faith. For Screwtape, this is a way to keep the person in a state of confusion and superficiality, where they never come to seriously question the fundamental issues about life, death, and eternity. Reflecting on this, I realize how much I need to seek a posture of intellectual humility, recognizing that there is always more to learn about God and about spiritual life. The pursuit of genuine knowledge, whether scientific or theological, must be accompanied by a willingness to be surprised and to admit that we do not always have all the answers. This posture keeps us open to God's action in our lives, allowing Him to guide us beyond our human limitations and perceptions. After reflecting on Screwtape's instructions to Wormwood and the various points addressed in his strategies, I am impressed by the depth and relevance of C.S. Lewis's critiques of how modern society deals with spiritual matters. The text not only offers a creative view of the spiritual battle we face daily, but also challenges us to consider how we are living and perceiving the reality around us. Screwtape makes it clear that his goal is to keep human beings disconnected from the truth and distant from God, whom he refers to as the enemy, the way he guides Wormwood to use distractions, the superficiality of thought, and the attachment to the daily grind to keep the patient. From deep reflection on faith is a portrait of a strategy that appears subtle but is extremely effective. I realize that he believes the safest way to divert a person is to keep them busy with the things of the world and convince them that these are the only important realities. For him, it is preferable that people remain stuck in what he calls real life, which consists only of the sensory and immediate experiences, and that they set aside any consideration of the supernatural. This view makes me reflect on the need to always be alert. C.S. Lewis's text reminds me that distraction and superficiality are powerful tools in the hands of the spiritual enemy. If I am not careful, I can easily be led to focus only on the material, the practical, and forget the importance of keeping a mind and heart turned towards God. Faced with these reflections, I feel it is essential to seek a balance between living in the world and not letting it dominate me. For me, this means dedicating intentional time for prayer, for reading the scriptures, and for moments of silence in which I can open myself to the presence of God. In a world that constantly tries to capture our attention on what is immediate, these moments become a form of spiritual resistance. Screwtape reminds us that the true spiritual struggle often happens subtly in the daily choices and priorities we set. The Christian life is not just a matter of having correct beliefs, but of allowing those beliefs to transform the way we live. I must always ask myself whether I am just believing, or whether I am allowing that belief to shape my actions and my way of seeing the world. Additionally, I see the importance of keeping an open mind for learning and for deep reflection, recognizing that there is always more to discover about God and about the world He created. Instead of contenting myself with a superficial or generic view of faith and knowledge, I want to engage in a constant search for truth, remembering that true wisdom comes from God. Screwtape leaves us an important lesson about the challenges of living a solid faith in a world that values the immediate and the practical. He exposes human weaknesses and exploits them, but also shows us, by contrast, that it is possible to resist these pitfalls by turning towards what is eternal and true. I realize that the challenge for me and for many is not to be carried away by this current that distances us from the transcendent. The pressure of daily life, the excess of information, and the temptation to be content with easy answers are real obstacles, but they can be overcome with a renewed commitment to seek God with all our heart. I feel that amidst all this, there is great hope. The fact that Screwtape fears reason, argumentation, and deep reflection indicates that there is power in these aspects when we approach God with sincerity. There is hope in knowing that even amid distractions, the mind and heart can be awakened to the reality of God's love. The spiritual struggle is constant, but God's grace is even greater, and it empowers us to resist and to seek a life that reflects the truth we find in Him.